just going to start my timer here. I'm supposed to have like 20 minutes, right? Okay. All right. Okay, as Sister Penny mentioned, this is, I don't know if we'd call it a continuation, but it is related very much to the subject we had in January, which was Catholic marriage. And really, if we wanted to put things in order, we probably should have had this presentation first and then the one on annulment. But for those of you that were here last time, I think Deacon Ovi did a good job of explaining the very basics of what he needed to do about the idea of marriage before he talked about annulment. But just for my own information, can I see a hands on who was here in January? Oh, quite a few. Okay, great, great. Well, if you do have more questions at the end, I'm not going to talk specifically about annulments, although I don't even think I'm going to mention it. But if you have questions about that, or certainly questions about the topic for tonight, we can ask them as we go along, or at the end. Hopefully I'll have a few minutes for that. And, oh, here it is, looking for the way to change the slide. So, the topic is Catholic marriage, but I think when we think about that topic, we might think about Catholic marriage as really being perhaps a shorthand for what the topic really is. Can everybody see this, by the way? Because this is the color scheme that'll be throughout here. We can dim the lights, I guess, if we need to. We're okay? All right. So, because there really isn't any such thing quite as Catholic marriage that I know of anyway. That's not a term that's normally used. But what I'd like to talk about for a moment is marriage according to the teaching and the law of the Catholic Church. So just to clarify that a bit. So why are we discussing Catholic marriage? Well, I'm not sure what your reasons are, but as I sort of meditated and prepared over this presentation, there's a couple of things that came to my mind. And these are two of them that were new to me because I often think about this. But it is that marriage is vital to the survival of humanity. Now that sounds maybe obvious because, right, we have to have children, but it's not so obvious to much of the world. Many people in this world today don't believe that marriage is necessary at all, because there are alternate ways of having children, of course, but also that marriage is essential to God's plan of salvation. And in one sense, it is a very primary way, or the primary way of salvation, because we bring new life into this world. And how can there be salvation without new people coming to faith and coming to belief in Christ? So, we need to understand Catholic marriage in order to become marriage evangelists. I don't know about you, but that's what I consider myself, is a marriage. If anybody wanted to put a title onto me, that would be the one that I would most relate to. Because I think we really need to promote the idea of marriage in our society, all over our society. And then this last one here, second one here, is very important too, to advise those in troubled or irregular marriages, particularly our Cursillo candidates. You know, when we bring candidates to the weekend and there's a marriage issue, someone in a regular marriage, it shouldn't be the first call to Father Arang, can you talk to this person? No. We should begin to understand our candidates and say, well, sister, you know, I know some resources that could help with your situation to perhaps get your marriage blessed in the church or whatever it may be. So maybe if we're a little bit more familiar with both the teaching of the church on marriage and annulment, we might be able to do a better job. And the other thing is, when someone comes to us to be on a Cursillo weekend, and maybe they're not ready for the weekend at this point because of some issue like that, well, we shouldn't say, come back and see me when you're ready for the weekend, right? We should walk with the sister or brother to try and help them to prepare perhaps to be ready for a Cursillo weekend. And if maybe they'll never be ready for that, but maybe we can help them out to be more faithful Catholics, to be more faithful Christians. So, what is marriage? Let me just give you some ideas. This isn't what the church teaches necessarily about marriage, but looking at marriage from a couple of different ways. The social phenomenon. There's a lot of things we could say about that, and in the social phenomenon there are actually some alternate types of marriage that have been with us throughout much of our history, actually. Polygamy is one man with multiple women or multiple wives. Polyandry, which still exists today and has existed at various times in the world is one woman with multiple husbands. And interesting, I don't want to diverge too much, but some of the reading I read on this is one of the most common occurrences of this were when a woman would marry a family, and it would be all of the husbands would be brothers, essentially. And so that was not too uncommon of a practice, but it wasn't really common. Polygamy is much more common and was much more common. And then, of course, monogamy, which is one woman and one man. By the way, throughout history, monogamy has been primarily the relationship of marriage, even in societies where there was polygamy, and I'm not sure if I always pronounce this right, polyandry. And then, of course, what is marriage? There's a religious practice, and not just in the Christian religion, but in many religions there is a recognition of the importance of a man and a woman coming together, and it's all, for the most part, always because it recognizes that need to bring new life into the world. Of course, we understand marriage to be, as Catholics, we understand marriage to be a sacrament. And I should really say as Christians, although many Christians don't realize that, even those who are actually in sacramental marriages, and you'll see why I said that in a moment. And then, of course, very important, we recognize marriage as a vocation. And this is particularly recognized today in the church, although it may have not been so much recognized through all of church history. Okay, in the early church, there is a whole history of how the church has viewed marriage, and I would say that we're very blessed today because the theology of the sacrament, the theology of marriage, has really blossomed in the most recent years, particularly with things like the theology of the body, which was written by soon-to-be Saint, Blessed John Paul II. And so many things we've come a long ways in studying marriage. For instance, if you want to learn about marriage, don't read St. Augustine. Okay, I'll just tell you that right now. If you want to learn almost anything else about the church, read St. Augustine. But if you want to learn about marriage, I recommend staying away from St. Augustine. I don't have time to go into all those details right now, but if you want to talk to me afterwards, I'll be happy to discuss it. So, what is marriage? There's a couple of ways of looking at this too. If we look at it from the basis of law, if you will, there's a natural law. And interestingly enough, natural law very much supports what the church teaches about marriage and what primarily has been the understanding of marriage throughout history. Because natural law talks about what's called pair bonding. That word is borrowed from a book actually by I forgot his last name. He wrote a book called The Naked Ape way back when I was young about the notion that we understand that a man and a woman are brought together on a biological sense in the way that a human being is designed, totally biological, no spiritual aspect of this, that we are brought together to raise children. And that's part of the reason it takes so long to raise children. I mean, it doesn't take very long to raise other animals, if you will, but for human beings, it takes a long time. Civil law, it is a contract. And of course, there are good reasons why we have those contracts. Again, they were primarily to support the idea of marriage as being good for the state or good for the society. And then church has canon law, which considers marriage to be a covenant. A contract, but a little bit more than just a contract. So, let's just read the definition of marriage that comes to us from the Catechism of the Catholic Church in the glossary. It says, marriage is a covenant or partnership of life between a man and a woman which is ordered to the well-being of the spouses and to the procreation and upbringing of children. When validly contracted between two baptized people, marriage is a sacrament. So, of course, the church focuses on these purposes of marriage, which is to unite the husband and wife for their own benefit. And then this other reason, which, of course, is to bring new life into the world, new children, and to nurture those children. So, I'm moving through this pretty quickly because we have a lot of material to cover. So stop me if you have questions. I may not go into quite as much explanation as I would like to do if I had about 4 hours to do this. Okay. Character of marriage. There's three things I'd like to mention, and these are very much at the heart of the church teaching on marriage. Marriage is conjugal and procreative. So it is, of course, the obvious that a man and a woman physically come together in the sexual relationship. It is conjugal and it is procreative, because out of that relationship, of course, comes our cooperation with God's creation in bringing new life into the world. It is indissoluble. In other words, a marriage cannot end. Now, there's an exception to that, of course. You end the marriage at death. Okay, so it's insoluble for a lifetime, and then after one of the spouse's death, the marriage ends. And so that's what the church teaches about it. And then finally, it is unity. There is an amazing, miraculous thing that happens when a man and a woman come together in a marriage. The two become one in a very mysterious, spiritual way, in an obviously physical way, at least for times in a sense, but in a very profound spiritual way. So what makes a marriage valid? Now this I will digress on for just a moment. The church has these terminologies that are good for you to be familiar with, because they're used in all kinds of different ways. There are two things that the church speaks about when something is, if you will, right or correct. It is valid and it is licit, which means valid means that it does what it's supposed to do, essentially, and licit means it's actually legal. So those are the two things that are spoken of. And when we speak of sacraments, we speak typically of two things that are required, and that is form and matter. So there's a form in which the sacrament takes place, and there's a matter or a material that is required for the sacrament. And so for a marriage, and now there's a little bit of distinction here, because we're not talking about necessarily a sacramental marriage at this time. We're just talking about a marriage. For a marriage to be considered valid by the Catholic Church, it has to have these two things correct. Form, and that is the witnessing of the consent by an ordained cleric, that is with proper authority. So, for instance, I actually can't go to San Jose and be the witness to a marriage. I can, but I have to get permission to do it from, essentially from the bishop through the pastor of the church. Matter is the consent itself, but not just the consent, the people, okay? The man and the wife have to be there, and they have to give their consent that they are engaging in this covenant relationship. Okay, and I will mention that. I wasn't going to really mention, but I should probably mention just briefly what a covenant is. Most of you have probably heard me say this already on various Cursillo weekends, but the difference between a covenant and a contract is that a covenant has no provision to break it. It basically can't be broken. Every legal contract, normal legal contract you have, has provision to be broken as part of the contract. But marriage or covenant relationships do not have a provision to break the agreement. Just a note there, the ministers of a valid marriage in the Roman Rite Catholic Church is the couple. And I stress Roman Rite because that's actually not true in the Eastern Rite churches. It's actually the minister. But in the Roman Rite, it's the couple. Okay, so what makes marriage sacramental? You might recall from the definition of the catechism that I read there, the bottom line told us the marriage is validly contracted, so the form and the matter are the same that I mentioned, and then both the man and the woman are baptized. You notice, are baptized. It doesn't say they're Catholic. So if a man and a woman who are baptized Christians come to a Catholic church, because that's really part of the form, at least in this diocese, it has to be within the Catholic Church. There can be exceptions to that, so don't be too literal, take me too literally, but it has to have the right form and manner, so it's witnessed by the cleric, and of course the people come with giving that consent. Whether they're Catholic or not, the marriage would be a sacrament as long as they're Christian. Now, it's typically not going to happen unless one of them is Catholic. But even for the one who is not Catholic, the marriage is sacramental. Now, they may not believe that, but it still is the case. If their intent was to have the kind of marriage that the sacrament calls them to, then the marriage is still sacramental.
So, Deacon Steve?
Yes.
So it's not true that both man and woman are baptized, because it can be that one person in the in the relationship, maybe not a baptized Christian, it could be an atheist or a Muslim, for instance. But given that, will it still be sacramental?
No, it will be valid and listed, but not sacramental.
Even if it is officiated within the Catholic Church?
That's correct. It is not sacramental, it is only valid. And of course, just for everybody, because I know Deacon knows this, but just for everyone else's information, that is possible. You can marry someone who is not baptized, but it does require permission. And actually, it also requires permission to marry someone who is not Catholic, who is Christian but not Catholic. It's a little easier to get that permission, and it's fairly easy to get both of those permissions nowadays. But it is recommended that you marry a Catholic if you're Catholic. The Church still recommends that, and I highly recommend it. But
Permission from
Question, Father.
Yeah.
Is, so when you, they should be both baptized before it becomes sacramental, right?
they both have to be baptized, yes.
So, but then if one is like other religion, like Buddhism or Muslim, then you need to get permission, right?
Well, there's two cases of permission. They're slightly different permissions, but if one is Muslim and one is Catholic, you have to get permission.
But because of that permission, if the other one then get baptized, still it will not be going to be sacramental.
No, it still won't be sacramental. However, if one of the people is not baptized and that person later on becomes baptized, the marriage is immediately sacramental.
Oh.
If it was valid in the first place. Okay, if it wasn't valid, then you have to have it convalidated.
But do you have to be Catholic, just like you said, two different religions, one Catholic and one Muslim, and they got married, and you consider that they're both baptized for different denominations, so it's considered sacramental? No.
Well, not a Muslim. A Muslim, just to clarify here, a Muslim, a believer of the religion Islam, is not Christian. That's not a Christian religion. They are not baptized Christians. So the only time a marriage is sacramental if it is between two baptized Christians. So, and just maybe to help a little bit with that, the Catholic Church recognizes Christian baptism by any Christian faith. Now, you have to have, again, going back to the idea of form and matter, the form and matter has to be correct. But if you're a Baptist and you want to become a Catholic, we don't rebaptize you. We recognize that baptism as valid sacramental baptism. We probably better move on, and if you have more questions, hopefully we'll have a little time at the end. Maybe not. Okay. Sacramental marriage. Oops. So, everybody should be able to complete this. This is general, not just marriage. A sacrament is?
A visible symbol of God's love.
Okay, that's not the words I put, but it's correct. Yes. An outward sign, which sign, by the way, is what we're talking about with the form and the matter, instituted by Christ to give grace. Now, the Catechism says this about the sacrament: an efficacious, which means effective, sign of grace instituted by Christ and entrusted to the Church, by which divine life is dispensed to us through the work of the Holy Spirit. So the same thing, but said in slightly different words. And the reason I put that up there, I wanted to emphasize for a moment this notion of efficacious or effective, because there's this important sign of marriage that becomes effective in those who are married. And I would suggest to you that that is true to a certain level, whether the marriage is sacramental or not. And well, I want to say something, but if I say it now, I'll confuse you. But remind me at the end to say what wasn't on the slides, okay? So, what are the effects of marriage? It is a perpetual and exclusive bond. And in the sacrament, we have the grace to live out that perpetual and exclusive bond. Exclusive meaning, of course, just the one husband or one wife. The grace to perfect the love. It doesn't say we ever get to the point where that love is perfect. I like to look at the couples. There's a couple there, right? Deacon and Sister Cora. I thought they might look at each other at this point and say, you're not perfect yet. And I suspect, but the sacrament is giving you the grace to move in the direction of perfection, and that is how we are headed in the sacrament. And holiness, very important. This was not so much focused on a very long time ago in the church, if we go back to the Middle Ages or so. But now we very much focus on this on all the sacraments. We always did on most of the sacraments, but particularly in marriage, that it is a call to holiness. The sacrament should bring both of you to be more holy. And so that's part of the reason of the sacrament. And again, the church says, from a valid marriage arises a bond between the spouses, which by its very nature is perpetual and exclusive. Furthermore, in a Christian marriage, the spouses are strengthened, as it were, consecrated for the duties and the dignity of their state by a special sacrament. Okay, sacramental marriage is a sacred calling. Sacred means holy or set aside for a specific purpose. So when you become married, you are set aside for a purpose. Actually, several of them. You're set aside to help to make your spouse holy. Not that you make your spouse holy, but you assist them on the road to holiness, to be their helpmate, as it says. And that's both men and women. Of course, you're called to be open, to bring new life into the world as children. And you're called to be a sign of God's love for His church. Calling, of course, is a destiny to a particular way of following God's will. And so that's what marriage is. It's a vocation. Just as someone is called to the priesthood, that's their way of holiness and the way of bringing, hopefully, brothers and sisters along with them, just like we say in Cursillo. Marriage is a way that you bring others to Christ. When they see your marriage, they should want to run off to the church. Well, they should want to run off and be like you. They want what you want. Let's put it that way. They should see the love between you and be very much attracted. And of course, that calling brings us to a responsibility and a purpose that is in fact greater than us. Okay, sacramental marriage is also a very important defense against the snares of the devil, to help us on that road to holiness. So, and we do that because, and the two shall become one flesh. They are no longer two, but one flesh. It is that idea that as we come together and be one, that bond is much more powerful in our lives than what we had as single persons. And that's nothing against the single state of life. If you're called to be single, then God gives you the grace to live that life. But if you're called to be married, you need that grace of your marriage, your coupleness, as we sometimes call it in marriage prep, to resist the snares of the devil, in fact, to evangelize the world. So, the two truly do become one by the grace of God. Man and woman were made for each other. Not that God left them half-made and incomplete. He created them to be in communion of persons in which each can be the helpmate of the other. For they are equal persons, bones of my bones, and complementary as masculine and feminine. In marriage, God unites them in such a way that by forming one flesh, they can transmit human life, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth by transmitting human life to their descendants. Man and women as spouses and parents cooperate in a unique way in the Creator's work. So, just a note. How much time do I have? My timer just sort of stopped. I'm already over probably, huh? No? Okay. This is, these are not words from the Catechism. Most of the other long paragraphs that I put on there, and I know Deacon Noe's telling me, you're not supposed to do that in presentations. I know it, but sometimes I can't help myself because I won't be able to read it from somewhere else. So, anyway, these are my words, but it's a way of kind of summarizing what the Church teaches about this unifying aspect and the procreative aspect, particularly in the context of our sexual relationship. And it's important that I say this because of what I'm going to talk to you about in a moment, about our being protected against the snares of the devil, which this is part of the way that God uses the church to protect against the snares of the Marriage protects the gifts of human sexuality. The unifying and procreative purposes of sexual intimacy cannot be separated from each other and can only be effectively linked through a valid marriage. The unifying purpose is achieved by the man and the woman freely giving themselves to each other for each other's benefit. The procreative purpose is achieved through the co-creation with God of human life, and then nourishing and raising this new life in the faith that brought husband and wife together. Married couples must be open to children in each instance of sexual intimacy. And so I bring this up as being kind of a summary of what the church teaches, and we'll talk just briefly about it in a little bit more detail as we go on. Just wanted to mention something because I kind of was picking on St. Augustine earlier. One of the reasons is because of that part there that says the man and the women freely giving themselves to each other for each other's benefit. Church teaching for a while was very much to diminish the notion of pleasure. And in fact, some theologians actually taught that the pleasure in sexual intercourse was unholy or sinful. So you had to try and have sex without pleasure. They didn't quite go that far, but practically speaking, if you read the theology, they're almost saying that. And some suggested that even though the act was good, that the pleasure was still a venial sin, even. Some people suggested that. So that's why I say we're in a very blessed world because our theology has moved a little ways in the right direction. Not that we changed any of the fundamentals of what we believe, but our understanding of the integration of the human body. And much of that, what St. Augustine said, came about by a very negative influence in the church, which I'll mention just briefly on another slide. So marriage has been under attack by Satan ever since the Garden of Eden. You probably might remember this verse from the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. They will strike at your head, while you strike at their heel. And, of course, this is a reference to our Blessed Mother, the church teaches, but it's also this idea of Satan attacking the very institution of marriage, which, of course, he did when he tempted Eve and then caused Eve to tempt Adam, and from there it was a very much of a change in our world. So, the tools the devil uses against marriage. Gnosticism is the one I mentioned that sort of influenced St. Augustine. It was this idea that the body, the physical, was evil. And I'm not saying that Augustine was a Gnostic. The Gnosticism was a condemned heresy in the church many, many years ago. But there's a great deal of influence in that, both within the church and without the church. And interestingly enough, in the secular world today, Gnosticism is still alive, and it is sort of a reformed version of Gnosticism, but it kind of teaches the same thing. It says that the physical is not integrated with the spiritual, therefore I can do anything I darn well like with my body. That's the new Gnosticism. So it's been throughout the church, for the history of the church, and even probably before the church. Divorce. Divorce is also, of course, a great enemy of marriage. And I don't want to talk in detail. There are different viewpoints on that. I mean, we certainly, divorce, by the way, I should say what it is. It ends the legal contract of marriage. That's all it does. It doesn't end your marriage as far as the church is concerned. It ends the legal marriage. Poverty. The reason I say poverty is one of the things that influenced some rather poor marriage practices over the years, including the polygamy, in a sense, for certain women who would attach themselves to the king because it was a way to survive and a way to thrive. And so poverty has had negative effects on marriage throughout history, so that's why I mention that. And even today, in some sense, it is the idea that people feel trapped. Perhaps they're very poor and they don't stay in the marriage because they want to go off and be on their own because they feel it will be better for them economically. Contraception. Contraception weakens marriage and promotes abortion. One of the primary reason contraception is wrong is it tries to separate the unitive capacity, the unitive purpose of sexual intimacy from the procreated. So contraception is intrinsically evil, actually, the church says. And it does promote abortion. If you really look at it, abortion has been tremendously affected by contraception and not the way that Planned Parenthood would tell you. In vitro fertilization, again, it separates the procreative from the unifying. It also destroys embryos, but the primary reason it's wrong, I mean, that's very, very wrong, right, is that it separates those two conditions. So it is condemned by the church and also considered, by the way, intrinsically evil. It's not evil because of the circumstances, but it's inherently evil. Redefinition of marriage. And, you know, people sometimes say, well, you know, what's so important about that? You know, that, you know, gay people, so what? But it is really an attack on the fundamental notion of marriage, and so the church, of course, has come out very strong against that. And then academia. The academic environment is very much against what the church teaches about marriage. And it's probably worse off in many cases in Catholic schools in this country. Not all of them, please, not all of them. But I mean, I was shocked at what was said at the graduation of my daughter from UCSB this last June. I'm not going to go into the details exactly, but basically the idea of the promotion of gay marriage at a graduation ceremony. And I mean, if you send your child to the university system in California, they will be indoctrinated in many things. And hopefully they'll be taught along the way something, and I think they will. I think they're probably taught a lot. But they will be indoctrinated in a number of things that go very much against the church. And I say indoctrinated because they typically aren't going to get logical arguments, and there won't be discussions about these things. It will be understood that you are to believe these things. So anyway, that's one of the, I would say, Satan's strongest allies of this age against marriage. But we do have this wonderful grace of the sacrament, and I kind of hated to end with that slide, but I knew if I went much longer, I'd be way over the 20 minutes. The previous slide, I should say. But, you know, we do have a wonderful gift of the sacrament of marriage in the church. And believe me, we will win because God says so. And so, even though there are a lot of forces against marriage, marriage is such a beautiful experience, and God's grace is so amazing. I think so many of you can testify to that are in wonderful marriages. And this good news needs to be taught. And another part of the good news, though, is, you know, I look at the young people that are around us today, and they will get this. They will understand this. If you go to, for instance, the March for Life, which I know isn't directly about marriage, but it really is, it's getting younger every single year. I mean, I feel like such an old person on that walk, I'll tell you. You look around, and you know, everybody's 20, 30, 40, 50 years younger than me. Well, some are, actually, but yeah. Okay, anyway, that was it. If we have some questions, I know we're pretty much out of time. I forgot what I told you to remind me to say. What was it about?
You said something about to remind you of something.
I know, but now I forgot what it was. Does anybody remember what I was talking about?
Well, 30 minutes. 30 minutes.
30 minutes?
See? So,
Okay.
any questions?
Well, you know what? When I asked about what is it about the validity of marriage, you said it should be each valid if both of them are baptized. Both of them are
Well,
baptized.
let me stop you right there. You're asking, it sounds like two questions in one. Validity of marriage is one thing. Sacramental marriage is something else. They're two related, but not exactly the same thing.
Okay.
So,
Sacramental marriage if both of them are baptized. But then you said also about the contract, it should be valid. It should be a valid contract for both of them. The marriage, sacramental marriage must also be a valid contract.
a valid marriage.
A valid marriage. So that is confusing me. Because my question earlier is that, how about if the other one is of different belief? there must be a permission, and then they will still be married, right?
They will be married, but it won't be sacramental. The marriage,
Sacramental.
see, let me just say what the church would tell you in a pastoral way. Let's say your daughter is getting married and she's going to marry a Muslim, okay?
So then it's not valid marriage then?
No, it is valid. They're different things.
But they're not
Now,
sacramental.
if you come and say, you know,
I would not accept it as valid if...
well, wait a minute,
What am I thinking?
you know what youth, I think is not important, and it sounds a little bit harsh, but as Catholics, we submit to the teaching of the Church, and the teaching of the Church is because she's been given the authority by Christ, she is the one who determines what is valid. I think I remember what I was going to say, but I'll do it after we finish this. So the Church says that marriage is valid if it has proper form and matter. It is valid. Now, the form and matter means that it's witnessed by the clergy, the consent is witnessed, and the consent is valid. So you're really making a covenant relationship. And in this diocese, most of the dioceses in the United States, that has to be in the Catholic Church. Sometimes there are exceptions where it could be done somewhere else. But that is the rule of the Church, and so that makes the marriage valid. But it will only be sacramental if both the people are baptized Christians. And that makes sense if you think about the theology, is that baptism is the gateway to the sacraments. So you can't have any other sacrament unless you've been baptized. So that's really the way to think about that. Sister Cora.
Maybe you can explain the difference more clearly if you tell us what happens if our marriage is not sacramental, in plain words. I mean,
Not sacramental or not valid?
sacramental, not sacramental. Because the confusion is they equate sacramental to validity.
Yeah.
What you're saying, right?
Right, okay.
We have a valid, but not
Yeah, okay, let me explain that then. That would be better.
Yeah.
Okay, if you are in a valid marriage, okay, compared to a sacramental marriage, well, the first thing that's different is that you're not receiving the grace of the sacrament, that special grace of that special sacrament. The other thing that is important, though, for the baptized person, the baptized Catholic, is that person is still in a valid marriage. He's still done everything according to the Church. He's still eligible to receive Holy Communion. Okay. If the marriage was both not sacramental and not valid, the person is in violation of church law and is not supposed to receive communion. So the advantage, if you will, of having the marriage be valid and not sacramental, in other words, it can't be sacramental because, you can't force the person to be baptized, right? So if you're going to marry somebody who's not baptized, you want to be married in the church if you're a faithful Catholic, because that's what the Church tells you to do, and you can still celebrate the other sacraments. If you don't, then you're not supposed to celebrate the sacraments. So that's the difference between those two. But ideally, you want the marriage to be sacramental because you want the grace. Now, having said all that, these are the laws of the Church, and they are given to us by the authority of Christ, so we need to obey them. But also realize that Christ and God are, in a sense, even with the law of the Church, in a sense. So I believe, anyway, that if two people are in a marriage, and particularly a valid marriage, and even though they don't have the grace of the sacrament, God wants them to succeed in that marriage. He's somehow going to deliver that grace to them via some vehicle that they will survive in that marriage if they are, in fact, open to God's grace. Okay. Now, in many, many cases, the way we find he does that is later on they have a conversion and they come to the church. I don't know what percentage of the people in RCIA are in those kind of marriage situations, but I'm pretty sure it's a fairly large portion. So oftentimes that faith comes later on. Now, that's not meant to be an encouragement for you to encourage your children or yourselves, if you're still eligible to be married, to go out and marry someone who's not a Catholic. I strongly recommend trying to marry a Catholic. But keep in mind that God's grace will be there to anyone who is open to it. Yes, brother, and then I think this has to be the last question.
Yeah, last one.
I'm really in trouble.
Last question.
Do you consider the Mormon Christian religion?
No, the Mormon baptism is not considered Christian baptism. It's a good point because there are some areas that may be questionable, so you might have to ask. But the Mormon religion itself is not, theology does not line up with other Christian theology. Yes.
I've been told no, but
Last one.
he's one of the senior members of my team. I
Can a divorced person can receive the Eucharist?
A divorced person can receive the Eucharist provided they're not in an illicit relationship. So if they're divorced and not remarried, are divorced and not checking up, then well, then yes, divorce does not prevent. And the reason is, or at least part of the reason is, that divorce doesn't really end the marriage. They're still married, actually. So a divorced person can, yes, definitely, not only can, they should attend Eucharist and should maintain that faith life.
Because I tried to I just happened to Google something about that. And I thought they're not allowed to receive the Eucharist. But I Googled it and they said that they have the right to receive the
No, yes, that's correct. Absolutely. If you are divorced, you should still go to Eucharist, like I say, unless you've been remarried and not validly, then that's a problem.
Okay, thank you.
So it comes and all.
yeah. I was going to say that, but I didn't want to start all over again.
So now our technical talk will be at what a timing